Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. I don't know if Rohit is here, but inevitably I never end up making it easy for Rohit. I try to worm out of stuff as much as possible, but he's just incredibly persistent. So here I am again. Um, when I asked Rohit, what is it that you would like me to speak on today, he said, "As you are led." Now that is such a scary line because in my head, I most of the time I don't know what I'm led to do. The second thing is if I do something and I say that I'm led, but if it's not impacting the ones I'm listening to, was I really led? So I decided to take the safe way out. Yeah. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the last week, in the last week, this is what we celebrated as a church, the Jonah fast. It's a 3-day fast, which is supposed to, at least for us, in our calendar, it's 25 to 27. That's 25th, 26th, 27th. And 28th is the Holy Communion, which sort of culminates what's happened on these 3 days. Okay, so it's the Jonah fast. Now, the Jonah fast is based on Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, where the people are asking Jesus for a sign. And
Christo uncle, not able to hear you.
Okay.
No, it's better.
Is
It's breaking. There are moments when we can't hear you.
hang on. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Now it's fine. Okay, yeah, that's good. Right. So 25th to 28th Jan is the Jonah fast, right? So what I thought we'd do is, as many times as you've probably heard it before, I thought for my sake, if not so much yours, I decided to go through the Book of Jonah again, right? So that's what I hope to do. Jonah appears in one verse in the Old Testament, uh, apart from the book, which is in 2 Kings 14:25, where it talks about how he was around during the time of Jeroboam's reign. And also, interestingly, in that 14:25, it talks about Jeroboam being somebody who restored the borders of Israel, as in he went and captured some areas, right? Expanded Israel to what it used to be. So he was a conqueror in a sense. Now, that conquest, also, all this is in verse 14:25. All this conquest was done at the instruction of the Lord. The instruction of God, was given through Jonah, the son of Amittai. So we would generally consider Jonah as to be somebody who's, a hardcore nationalist, a patriot, right? He's been advising the country on conquest, and good things have happened. He was from a place, Gath Hefer, which is near Nazareth. Okay, now the book of Jonah, in many ways, is a set of two sets of three categories. There's one where God speaks to Jonah. The second category is where he encounters pagans. And the third one is where Jonah speaks to God. These are the three broad areas. It happens 2 times in the book. So, the first time, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it. So now the Assyrian capital is what Nineveh is. It's a huge city, and why I write 3 days long is because later on in Jonah it says it takes 3 days to actually cover the whole area of the city. That's how big it was. It was around 500 miles away from Samaria, which was the capital of NK Israel, is Northern Kingdom Israel. At that time, Assyria was ruled by Shalmaneser III. Now, Assyria, I mean, if you look at the fourth point, God says their wickedness has come up before me. Now, Assyria was known to be one of the cruelest kingdoms of the time. They were professionals in torturing people. They came up with stuff that for us sounds crude, but extremely cruel and painful. So this was not a bunch of people who were liked by anybody. Their biggest enemy were the Egyptians, but in order to get from Assyria, which is say around Iraq today, down to Egypt, you would have to end up crossing an area where Israel was. So Israel was in the middle of a crossroads, right, between two horribly great powers. So the context is you have Nineveh, capital of Assyria, that is a terrible, terrible set of people. Now, but Jonah arose to go to Tarshish. So from Jonah's perspective, what was really the point? What is the point of him going to Assyria and talking to them? It is possible that he might have been scared, right? When I go to Assyria, and this is a kingdom of people that specialize in torturing people, what's going to happen to me? That could be one point. The second point, which is actually a little more, I would say, borne out by what happens in the rest of the book, is he did not want God to give them a chance. He hated them. He likes the concept of judgment, but he didn't like the concept of mercy as far as it applied to Nineveh, applied to Assyria. So he knows God well enough that mercy is a part of God's agenda. But he insists that he knows better. If it was judgment alone, he would be okay, because judgment would inevitably mean, fire and brimstone, but mercy doesn't. So what he does, decides that he doesn't want to give Assyria a chance, Nineveh a chance, and he goes to Spain, right? He starts off from Joppa, where he catches his boat, and he moves over to, starts his trip towards Tarshish. I'd like you to spend a little time reading this. On a day when prejudice and hate inflame men's emotions and pervert their judgment, the book of Jonah speaks with compelling force about limiting our love and sympathies only to some of our fellow human beings and excluding others from our pity and compassion. It's very relevant today. I mean, I'm sure it's relevant at all times of history. But the more and more we see today, especially in the news, about how we are so split into camps in a terrible way. Now, the easiest example of today is, what is happening in the American politics, where they kept using the word, there's no agreement at all. Everyone has got a partisan agenda, which is pretty much here. It is pretty much the case here in India as well, where we see a lot of that, where we see that love and sympathy are some things that we are only going to extend to people who we consider our own, and refuse to include others who are not of our own. We'll see a little more of that as we come into the next section. So, in our lives, who are our Ninevites? Who are the people in our lives who we know but refuse to extend our compassion to? See, it doesn't even have to be somebody of another religion. or of another culture. It can be someone in your setup who you believe is living the kind of life or has done some things to you that just simply cannot be forgiven. And you are willing to extend your love and your forgiveness and your sympathy to X number of people, but you refuse to extend it to another person. So, question for you for today: who are the Ninevites in our lives? Moving on. So, the previous slide you saw, but Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish. And then the next one is, but, and these are verses I'm quoting directly. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea. So there we are. Jonah comes over to Joppa. Now, ships or transportation is not something that's, it's not like an Indigo flight where you have one every 15 minutes or 30 minutes. It doesn't work that way. A few times in a year, you have ships traveling in certain directions. And it so happened that when he went there, there was a there was a ship available, and there was room available, and he had money. So, as it says in the book, he paid a fare, he got into the boat waiting for departure. All was going well. Sometimes in our life, we tend to do this as well. We take two or three, we go in a certain direction, we see two or three circumstances that happen to be working, in our favor, and we just automatically assume that, yes, this is what I was supposed to do all along, or this is the will of God, or all those, those fancy things that we use to make ourselves feel right. So the trip begins, and you have a great wind on the sea. Now the sailors prayed. Now, for those of you who know people who have been at sea or have been at sea yourself, you see, the last people to panic in a storm are usually the sailors. Usually. It's the people who have not been to sea who actually panic the most when a storm comes. The only reason is because they've been there and done that. It's not new for them. All they will tell you is, okay, this particular storm, has got winds of so many knots. It's going to be like this. This is what we're going to do. So in order to, this is what we're going to have to do to stay safe. So let's just follow the protocol. You rarely find sailors going down on their knees instantly as soon as a storm comes, which pretty much shows that when the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, it was a pretty bad wind. Sailors reached a point where they actually started calling out to their God. So this was something like they had not seen before. It was different. So what is the first thing they do? I've just written in jest, they misplaced luggage. What they did is they threw luggage out to see if that would help master situations, but no use. Now, I don't know how many of you have sung the song, Master, the Tempest is Raging, but if you have, that referred to the story of Jesus calming the storm. And that's the emotion that the disciples went through. Because while the storm was happening, Jesus was sleeping. And they went down and they called him and they said, "Don't you care for us that we are sinking?" And he comes up and he calms the storm. The sailors here, they did whatever they could. Nothing was working. They went down, they found this guy sleeping, Jonah, and they asked him, "Come up and help, don't sleep. Don't you know what we're going through?" Just have a read of this, please. Jonah lay fast asleep, not of submission to God, as in the case of Jesus' sleep on the stormy Galilee lake, but because of a spiritual numbness that was caused by a dull conscience. He was at peace that he's created for himself. He's not at peace that comes from God. So, what do the sailors do? If you think about it, the sailors were much, or at least in this situation, they showed a certain amount of hope, justice, and integrity. All three much more than Jonah did. So what do? The sailors investigated, right? When they talked to Jonah, they said, who are you? Where are you from? What is your trade? What's going on? So Jonah says, he starts off saying, I am a Hebrew. And then he goes on to explain to them what it is that he's done. So the question that they have is, why have you done this? For the men knew that he had fled from the presence of the Lord. Jonah says, okay, this is my fault. So throw me out. Now, when he says throw me out, you need to understand, he's not expecting a fish to come and pick him up. He's reached a situation where he sees that he is putting the life of a lot of people in danger. And this is the first time in this book that he's actually doing something that is pro somebody else. He's been selfish so far. So he's actually told them, fine, you're not going to escape this, and neither am I. But the chances are you throw me out, things are going to be okay. Now, what did these guys do? They didn't sort of just grab him and throw him at the first instance. They actually tried to get back to shore. They tried to get back to shore, but it didn't work. So they threw him out. As soon as they threw him out, all was calm. After the calm, they offered a sacrifice to this new God that they have discovered. Initially, when they started off, they said they cried to their gods. Everybody cried to his own God. But once this was over, having seen the power of Jonah's God, after the situation was over, they offer a sacrifice. It's very easy to okay, the phrase they use is foxhole conversions. Foxhole conversions basically refers to a situation where you are, like say World War II and stuff, you're inside a trench and there's firing all around you, right? When all that is happening, it's very easy to say, okay, God, I'm here in the middle of this. If you get me out of this from today onwards, I am your man, right? Submitted to you 100%. But as we all know, we've all been through, at least most of us have been through these foxhole moments. But as soon as the danger is over, things are back to normal, right? These guys, interestingly, after the foxhole situation was over and they realized what was going on, is when they decided that, yeah, this is probably a good God to trust. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. So far, it was all action, right? God is telling him to do something. He's running away, getting into a boat, moving out into the sea. The storm comes, investigation, they throw him out. Suddenly, he's grabbed by a sea creature, and everything stops. All action ceases. Now it's a situation where it's between a man and his God alone. So what does he do? He prays. Chapter 2. If you go through this prayer, and it's a good 9 verses, you would see that he goes through all of this. Repentance, submission, restoration, confession, thanksgiving. In fact, in verse 6, he actually says, the earth beneath barred me in forever, but you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. The miracle, more than the fish rescuing him and spitting him out, was the fact that there was this broken relationship that was restored. And at the end of the prayer, he actually says, it's a cry. In verse 9, it says, salvation comes from the Lord. he's on a high by the end of that prayer. But unfortunately, as we know, his repentance is partial, and God continues to work on him. And I see in this many instances of my own life where I've gone through situations where my prayers have been probably spectacular. But I find that, as life goes on, things change. And I have to be worked on again, which is what God continues to do on Jonah, but in a much, much more spectacular way. So here we are. Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city. Part 2. So now God has given him a second chance. Not everybody in the Bible gets a second chance. Very few people do. I'm not saying that nobody does or nobody shouldn't, but very few people do. Another person who comes to mind would be Peter, right? After all that he did, he was given a second chance and he did marvelously. So as far as the book goes, it says he goes into Nineveh, chapter 3. He goes into Nineveh and he says, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. Now, this wasn't a nice message. He wasn't sugarcoating it, right? He wasn't sort of, there's one thing that this is an old method that they used to do in firms when you were doing assessment, appraisal time, right? They call it, they say, give a person a sandwich. Sandwich means the bread on top, you say something good about him or his positive points. Then the next thing you do is to tell him the areas he could have improved. And then you end it with a summation of actually how nice he is, right? So you have the appraisal sandwich. Now, Jonah does no such thing. He just goes there and say, 40 days and you are toast, all of you. It's almost like you guys have got it coming and I'm going to escape, boo to you. And he wasn't expecting any magic to happen anyway, right? So he's got an opportunity to go and tell among his worst enemies that you're all going to die in 40 days. But I guess the question that he should have asked himself was, why even 40 days? Why 40 days? Why was God giving them 40 days? The very fact that he was giving them 40 days means he was giving them a chance, which he didn't need to. But anyway, so instantly, unfortunately for Jonah, the people of Nineveh believed him. They believed this God. And they instantly went into sackcloth and fasting. In fact, their king says things on the lines of, turn away from violence. In fact, the verse says, yes, let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Now, this is a kingdom whose USP is violence. Not just violence, customized violence. Guys who do a really good job at being violent. So the king is telling them, move away from your violent ways so that this God might have compassion on us. Now, there are historians that say that before this period, before Jonah came to speak to them, Assyria went through a few periods of famine and revolts and stuff like that. They went through a bad time. So the thought is that their hearts or the soil was fertile enough for a message like this. So when it came, it was easier for them to accept, right? That's what they say. Not that God can't hit hard hearts, but this is another reality of the story. So what did God do? God saw their works and and that they turned away from their evil way. Now, when they say God, at no point in time are they talking about Jehovah. And when Jonah says what he says, his is not an evangelistic message as much as it is a warning that there is a God that's going to beat you guys up if you don't change. It was almost a social message in a way, strangely. But that was enough for them to change their minds and to go away from the things that they didn't do. Now, if you think about it, what was the point of this? I mean, Nahum himself had prophesied that at a certain point in time, Nineveh will be crushed. So anyway, Nineveh is being crushed. It's going to happen. So why is God doing this? Now, there's a concept called othering people, Othering, othering people. I don't know if you've heard of this. Now, othering people is basically reducing a certain maybe culture or religion or nationality, whatever, to a certain set of characteristics and saying, oh, they are like this, they will never improve. And what you do is you ignore them completely, you exclude them from whatever it is that you might want. You don't intend that they get any good. You just other them. That's what Jonah is doing to the Ninevites, and that's what anybody who was reading this book at the time, who were Israelites, because you need to understand, Israelites are reading this book, and this is a book that's being written where, I mean, in this book, among their greatest and cruelest enemies are getting a second chance. So these are people that they have othered. Like, we are God's children. These people are going to die soon, for sure. But God is going to these others who are being othered to give them a second chance, which is something that they just can't take. So God sees their works and they turn from their evil ways. Ideally, the book should end there, right? Because here you have a prophet. However reluctant he was, he did do what the Lord said, and Nineveh was saved, and everybody lived happily ever after until the next prophecy came along. But it doesn't stop there. It actually gets far more interesting now. So what has happened? Verse 4 says, chapter 4 says, but Jonah was greatly displeased and he became angry. And he told God, was this not what I said when I was still at home? This is why I was so quick to flee. I know who you are. You are gracious. You are merciful. You're slow to anger. You're abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. You know where he's getting this from? From Exodus 34, verse 6, where God tells this about himself. So you are all this. I know you're all this. This is why I am not happy. So, what do? Take my life from me. I'm not, it's just not worth it. I'm not going to sit around and see these people prosper. Just take my life from me. Again, something for you to read. When things don't turn out as we wish, we seek to justify our disobedience before God. What we need to learn is that we are not sufficient to figure out what is the proper outcome, nor are we responsible for the outcome. We are only responsible for performing God's will for us. Our buck stops there. We're not expected to think beyond, or we're not to act like God, because what did Jonah really want? If you look at the whole picture, what does Jonah really want? Jonah wants a God of his own making. He wants his own custom-made God. God, when I tell you to beat up my enemies, you beat them up. When I tell you to spare us, even though we're bad people, just spare us. That's what Jonah was looking for, because he felt that he was responsible for the performance of God's will. So God asks him a question. Is it right to be angry? And what does he do again? Back to form. He runs away. But he doesn't go as far as Spain this time. He just sort of takes a walk. He takes a walk and he makes himself a shelter, sat in its shade to see what would happen to the city. Now, I don't know if he was expecting God to change his mind or for something fantastic to happen and the city, blasted out of its existence. But he just sat around. He was not happy. He made his own shelter. Then the Lord prepared a plant. The Lord prepared a plant that helped him out. So all was good. But the next day, the Lord prepared a worm to take care of the plant. So the plant withered. And again, the Lord prepared a vehement east wind. I think it is the khamsin. Khamsin in Arabic means 50. It's a particular type of wind that blows in. I forget from where to where, but it's a bad wind. It's a tough wind. So he prepares this wind to make sure that he gets Jonah's attention. Sometimes that's what happens, right? Things have got to happen to us in such a way that we actually stop. Like earlier, I showed you a couple of slides ago, all action stopped. When did it stop? When he was in the belly of the creature. Now again, it is stopped. God is sort of smashing him down to the point of where he's got Jonah's 100% attention. And Jonah is desperate again. It is better for me to die than to live in this way. As it is, you have insulted me, a prophet, by sending me to our greatest and most violent enemy. You have made me tell them your judgment, and instead of them rejecting me or rejecting you, and instead of you burning, sending fire and brimstone and fire, they listen to you. You've given them 40 days, and now even their king is in sackcloth and ashes and fasting and all that. So I might as well die. I read a few things as I was preparing for this, and one of them was this brilliant book. I didn't finish it, by and probably you guys would have read it, by Timothy Keller, called The Prodigal Prophet: The Story of Jonah. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. You should read it when you get a chance. He says, and he says this across the book. If you compare Jonah to the people in the prodigal son. So here you have Jonah acting as the younger son who refuses to listen to reason and runs away. And then when the son comes back, you see Jonah acting like the older brother, saying, I don't care if you want to take him in, Father. I don't like this. And here you have a father like whom Jonah is supposed to act. As in, when you have a situation where you need to extend forgiveness, you extend forgiveness. You welcome the errant child back into your system. So you have both the Jonah younger son and Jonah older son trying to escape the clutches of God in two ways, if you think about it. The younger son quite literally ran away, right? Ran away because he wanted to escape his father's clutches. What did the older son do? The older son obeyed every single thing that his father told him to, right? Crossed every T, dotted every I. But what was he doing? I mean, his emotion tells it all. He was trying to get his father to be obliged to him. See, I went to church today. See, I prayed 4 times today. See, I gave this much money. Now you're obliged to me. I don't have to act in the way you ask me to, simply because I've done what I need to do. Now you, Father, or you, God, are obliged to me. So you can't tell me, a prophet, who's actually given your word to kings, who've told them about the conquest that they need to do. I have been a good prophet. I've not been a false prophet. I've done all the things you want me to do, and now you're expecting me to be happy and to join you in this, in the spirit of togetherness and, la la la, kumbaya, my Lord kind of moments. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. It's better for me to die than to live. God asks him the second time, is it right to be angry? But this time he adds a bit about the plant. Is it right to be angry about the plant? You've had pity on the plant for which you neither tended or made it grow. It sprang up overnight and it died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? If you look at the prodigal son, it also ends with a cliffhanger. It's a cliffhanger. There's no happily ever after. We don't know instantly, as in what Jonah said to him. In the prodigal son, he just makes a statement. It doesn't say that the older son understood or the older son agreed. It's a cliffhanger. Both these stories stop in the same way. One is a parable, the other one is a real story. Now, if I were to look at this reluctant prophet, here's somebody who experienced mercy but gave none. He received love, returned none. He benefited from God's patience. In this whole book, that's what we see. But resented God showing patience to Nineveh. However, there is a but. Now, the but is, if you think about it, how are we reading the story? This is a story that is, I mean, the only public part of the story is the ship, the sailors there, and Nineveh. Nothing else is public. It is an interaction between a man and his God and the things that happened. So how do we know the story? It's either Jonah wrote it himself, we don't know, or in some ways he is the source of the story. Like how they say Peter dictated to Mark, I think it was. So when you see Mark's depiction of the gospel, you can feel Peter through it. In fact, they say, I don't know, I haven't checked it out, they say that Peter is most badly treated by an author in Mark as opposed to the other 3 books. And this is the guy who's writing, who's dictating the story. He's taking it hard on himself. So here's Jonah, who is the source of the story, telling us what he has gone through, giving us a message that possibly this is what we need to think of at every point in our lives. We once were lost, but now are found. We were blind, but now we see. Another quick point here as I end would be, if you look at the story of the Good Samaritan and compare it to Jonah, the question that started off the story by Jesus, the parable from Jesus, was, who is my neighbor? And the story ends with a fantastic question by Jesus again. Jesus answers this question. The parable was an answer to the question, who is my neighbor? And at the end of the parable, Jesus asks them the question, who acted like a neighbor? So if you were to ask Jonah, who is my neighbor? Or if you were to ask each one of us, who is our neighbor? We might have something to think about. Because if you identify a neighbor, means you need to do something for them. You see, we need to understand that let's look at the boat. Let's look at the ship. You have sailors and you have Jonah. They all need each other. Jonah had to do something which ended up saving the ship. I mean, never mind why and how and all the background to it, but there was a role that he had to play. If you have neighbors, or if you identify your neighbors, you will realize that there are things that your neighbors require of you. So the moment you identify your neighbor, you're in trouble. Because it's a given. You're expected to do something. That line is probably a good way to end, because today in church, we're celebrating the Christian role in nation building, which is part of our Republic Day sermon. So who is your neighbor in this country? Is it somebody you need to do something for? Are you able to do it? If not, figure out how. Thank you.
Thank you, Christo, for sharing that. We'll just pray and close there. But before that, anyone has any questions they would like to ask?
Have I stopped sharing? Sorry, sir. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes, Christo.
Oh, thank you. I'm still getting used to this. Okay, yeah, tell me.
Oh yes, Christo uncle, he was saying that.
Wait. Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I see your face? I don't know who's asking. It's very, very weird to talk to a computer.
Okay.
If it's okay, if it's comfortable, if you're comfortable, it would be nice. Otherwise, I'll take it. Okay. The fact that you're taking time shows you're uncomfortable. Okay, yeah, go ahead, ask me.
Oh, okay. He was saying that Jonah was angry because the people of Nineveh repented, because he did not want to extend mercy to them, and that was because he hated the Ninevites, and for pretty much good reason. They were expert in torturing people, and they were especially bitter enemies of Israel. But could it also be that he did not want to extend repentance to Nineveh because he knew they would take advantage of this mercy, and they would, because he was a prophet to Israel, and he had seen that Israel abused God's mercy, and he actually loved God, and that's why he was angry.
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and I've never thought of it from that point of view. However, I would just like to now correct when I say what I say, I'm going to go under a certain assumption of what you said. You need to correct me if I have understood you correctly. Okay. So one of the points that you made is him being a prophet. Wouldn't he have been aware that at a certain point in time, Ninevites would take advantage of this and do something bad? Is that what you meant?
Yes, he would have known because he saw in Israel how that happened, right?
Okay. Now we need to be a little careful here. Because going by what was done, right? Going by what they had been doing, not just to Israel, for the rest of the country as well, and saying that they would definitely do it in the future is just logic, right? It's got nothing to do with being a prophet. It's just, I mean, I would have thought the same thing. You would have thought the same thing, right? We wouldn't put our hand into the fire because we know what's going to happen, right? Now, but as a prophet, would he have had divination as to this is what's going to happen? I don't think that would be the case. And the only reason I don't think that, I can be wrong, the only reason I don't think that is because then God would end up looking pretty foolish. Now, God is the one who's telling this to him. If it was, and prophets depend on their words from God, right? I mean, what is basically a prophet? It's a conduit. It's not a soothsayer, right? What God tells them, they tell you. That's what it is. It's at no point, I think, do we get into a situation where as soon as a prophet opens his eyes, he's like Mr. Nostradamus. That's not the impression the Bible gives. Whatever message comes, he gives it. Now, the message of a prophet can be for the here and the now. It can be for the future as well. He's just transmitting what God says. So my thoughts would be, as a prophet, could he instantly foresee what's going on and trying to help God make up his mind? I don't think so. That's one. The second thing is, if he was a good prophet, and I'm going to use the word good because I'm going to come up with something, he would know that it was really not his business to advise God. Because, see, it's like this. Now, if you get all your information from a source which you know is impeccable. Oh, okay. I'm going. I'm going to go back to my favorite things to quote. All my most of my examples usually are from football. Okay. So if you don't know the player I'm talking about, my apologies, but you'll be able to get where I'm coming from. If you, as a fledgling football player, like, I want to learn how to play football, and somebody tells you, hey, look, I've got a friend, he can teach you. And lo and behold, your friend is Cristiano Ronaldo.
Okay.
Now the chances of Cristiano Ronaldo not knowing how to play the game is like incredibly remote. In fact, I'm talking in his position as a striker or forward or whatever he is, if you go tell him, I want to be that, the chances of you finding anybody else who will find one more point that he doesn't know is incredibly remote. So I'm just trying to use an analogy to say, for Jonah to go to the source of everything, even his own knowledge, right? Because he's a prophet of God. So everything that he's been saying so far to Jeroboam about the conquest that Israel needed to do was perfect. Everything worked out nicely. So for him to tell the source of all knowledge that, hey, listen, these guys do this and that and that and this. You know that if you forgive them, they'll go back to doing this and that and that and this. The logic is there. But unfortunately, he's speaking to the source of all wisdom, which should have given him a thought of, I don't know what's going on. Now, having said that, now I'm on my soapbox here. Having said that, I'm not saying he didn't have the right to ask. I'm never going to say that. The Psalms are full of people asking questions, of people getting depressed, by people wanting to run away from their enemy, all that sort of stuff. There was no question of not asking. But when you're told, and you're a prophet, to not do it is kind of weird. Now, also, just think about it. Just assume Anashwara, right? Have I got the name right? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Anashwara, just assume you are Jonah, right? And you're convinced that either as soon as you walk into Nineveh, these guys are going to rip you apart, right? Or, they'll just ignore you.
Yeah.
Imagine your shock when you go there and you say this, and they all suddenly bring out their sackcloths and all that sort of stuff. So I think there would have been a certain element of what in this, which I think should have cemented, or at least put one more nail into the coffin of doubt that he had. My God, I'm talking to Nineveh and they're repenting. What is going on? So the anger then was, oh, now they're repenting, you will definitely forgive them. So whichever way, God doesn't win in this. I mean, God just cannot win with Jonah. It's just impossible. You do this, it's like I wouldn't say the average Malayali husband, but some decent Malayali husbands. Whatever the wife does or cooks, this has got a little bit of this. Doesn't have a little bit of that. You never win. The wife never wins. She never gets it right because he's always got to be one step ahead of her. That's what I see this in Jonah. But again, it all comes down again to the reality that we are actually reading this, which shows me that things would have definitely changed for Jonah. Not that he shouldn't have gone through all this, or that, there's no, I'm not into this calling Jonah a bad guy because I'm reading the book. If I didn't read the book, maybe I might have had my thoughts. So I know I went all the way from here to Italy and back to try to address your question, but I hope it made sense.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be right to get angry at people who call God various names he shouldn't be called, and say that you're angry because you're hurt for God.
The problem here is we take certain situations and we try to make them absolutes. For instance, suppose somebody comes and tells you, okay, your God is a nutcase. Are you supposed to look at the book of Jonah and say, no, God will forgive them, God will God will take care of him, I shouldn't say anything? That's not it at all. Every situation has got its own versions. Now, if everybody was going to listen to the book of Jonah, why are there so many Christian missionaries dying in the world? No? Isn't it weird? Can't everybody just look at the book of Jonah and say, okay, God is going to forgive them anyway, see what Jonah did? I don't think we can take any one thing and make it as an absolute for everything. The only point is, and this is the tough one, are you guided by God to say or not say? There might be times where you're better off silent because God might have another plan for that person or for that community. But when God says say, are you going to say, no, Jonah didn't say, so I'm not going to say? It's all really down, it's all down to what you know of him and how much you listen to him. It really comes down to that. We can have, I used to be a huge fan of self-help books. I'm not saying that you shouldn't read self-help books. They're good. A lot of good ones out there. But one thing I realized after reading a lot of self-help books, and I've said this to the youth before sometime, that you find that unless you take those self-help books and you customize it for you, it's never going to work. Because that self-help book is written by that guy or that girl in his or her context, in what she knows, in what her culture is like. She was not brought up by the people you were brought up by. She didn't go to the kind of school that you did. She's not living in the kind of environment that you did, that you are. So you take stuff, I'm talking about self-help books, and you customize it to yourself. Otherwise, it will never work. So in that sense, taking one story or one verse from the Bible and making it an absolute is always going to be a problem. So straight answer to your question, or straight way I would be thinking about your answer is, your question is, if it's time to say no, or to oppose, or to write a piece even. There are people who write pieces. Do that. If you have an argument. Now, one of you, I forget who, I don't know who, one of you in this group has got a podcast. I'm serious. This is one way to get the message out. Take your pens, write stuff, write a song, do things that can further understanding of who this God is. Otherwise, you're forced to see. Again, back to my football analogy, right? So there are, okay, because there are people here, I think, who support certain teams or who support the teams that I don't. I will not name teams, but there is a particular team, starts with T. Oh, sorry. They're very strong on their defense. It's all about defense, right? They call it parking the bus. They start the game. Everybody comes and stands at the back, basically, right? Don't score against me. That's basically it. Now, tactics aside, how do you stop wearing out your defenders? You stop wearing out your defenders by distracting the opposing team through your forwards. You attack. There'll be less stuff on your defense. So if we as Christians are always going to sit around saying, no, as soon as somebody says something bad about me, I will respond in this spectacular way. I've got all the apologetics arguments here. I've sat at the feet of Joe's uncle, right? I can just boom it out. I'm saying, do it the other way. Go out there and do something. Go out and proactively deal with people's doubts before they even come up in their heads. Which is why I came back. I think it's Kevin, right, if I'm not mistaken, who's got the podcast. Yeah. And I listen to quite a few podcasts myself. I'm a huge fan of a lot of podcasts. And I think that's a great way to think, to get your message across. But in all this, please, 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 let's not absolutize any one section of the Bible, assuming that this is going to happen or that is going to happen, and this is the way I have to be, and there's no other way to do it. Don't do that. Again, gone around the world, and I've even roped Kevin into my conversation, but yeah, that's the way I would think about it.